Hey, Quinn, what are you reading?
Well, it's today's Hotline, but John, in my 43 years of the Hotline, this is the second worst Hotline I've ever read.
Come on, Quinn, don't be such a Welcome to Hotline TV, everybody. I'm John Mercurio.
And I'm Quinn McCord.
It is one of the busiest times of the year right now, Quinn, at the Hotline. Thank you so much for joining us for this very special election results edition of Hotline TV. We've had a very busy day here at the Hotline. We earlier this morning had a post-election day briefing given to us and some select members of the media by the heads of the Democratic Governors Association, not very happy this morning, Nathan Daschle, and the Republican Governors Association, Nick Ayers, much, much more jubilant in his mood. This morning. It was an interesting briefing. We talked to them for an hour with a bunch of reporters about the two elections last night in New Jersey and Virginia. Both of them, of course, going to the Republicans from the Democrats. So a big day for Republicans. Nick Ayers had an interesting point, I think, to make about not just the fact that they won these seats, they picked up both governor's offices, but how well they were able to do. And this is something that he said this morning.
That there's something else going on. We have said all along governor's races are about governor's records. There's no question that's ultimately what the race was about in New Jersey yesterday, but you don't get a 4-point Republican victory in New Jersey just about a governor's record. You don't get a 20-point Republican victory in Virginia when it's just about Bob McDonnell and Creed.
Interesting. So Nick now, I think, trying to make the point that there is a potential for a national dynamic coming out of these elections going into 2010. He said later during the briefing that he doesn't think that this has anything to do with 2010, that we're several eternities between now and Election Day in 2010, but that it was a very good day and that there really is something beyond these elections, these specific isolated governor's elections that we should be looking at. Do you agree with that, Quinn?
I kind of do, at least 50-50. I mean, it is true.
You can see both sides.
Yes, I can see both sides. I mean, Christie won by like 5 points.
Yeah.
Christie Todd Whitman, in both her original election and re-election, only won by about 1%. It's very hard for a Republican to get like even 49% in New Jersey, and it's very hard for a Democrat to get as low as like 45%.
Right.
And in Virginia, I mean, nowadays, Bob McDonnell did even better than George Allen did in '93, and that was a precursor to '94.
Right.
So, I mean, I think it's true that mostly these are all about the states in question, the candidates involved.
Right.
But there is a boost of a few percentage points in each race. I think is due to an overall sort of national environment.
Yeah, there's a lot of talk this morning and last night about the role of independents in this election day. You saw both Chris Christie and Bob McDonnell do extremely well, beating their Democratic opponents by double digits at least among independents. Nathan Daschle, who's Nick Ayers' counterpart at the Democratic Governors Association, had an interesting, I thought, interpretation for who in these independent voters are. In Virginia, he called them independent, sort of candidate-sensitive voters, people who look at the candidates. A lot of these people voted for Barack Obama, and now just a year later are voting for Bob McDonnell. Obviously, two politicians who really couldn't be more different in a lot of ways. And in New Jersey, he called them soft Republicans, people who live in a Democratic majority state, don't really want to be Republicans, but certainly don't want to be part of the majority party in the state. So they register as independents, but more often than not, vote Republican. Interesting. Let's go through each of the races, though. A lot to talk about briefly. First of all, let's go to New Jersey. Were you surprised?
Yeah, I mean, I think everyone was surprised. I mean, we all thought because the polling was going to be neck and neck, and of course, some of the polling all the polling was in margin of error, but some of the polling actually had Corzine ahead a little bit. So we all thought, well, everyone's agreed it's going to be a tight race. Could go into overtime or recount. They were lawyering up, but 100,000 votes. I found that surprising.
Yeah.
And of course, we all knew that Virginia would be kind of a blowout, and it was.
Well, we can talk about that in a minute. But before, let's talk. I think one of the biggest takeaways from New Jersey has got to be the Bush factor, or the lack of a Bush factor in the race. I think you've seen Democrats this year, mostly candidates for Senate and the House, really Democratic candidates tiptoeing around the idea, the strategy of trying to link their Republican opponents to George W. Bush. They did it so effectively in 2006. They did it in 2008. It worked for them. It got them the congressional majorities and the White House. But they're really not sure whether or not they can do it in 2010. And I think we saw in New Jersey that it's not an effective strategy. You had a Republican candidate who had served as a Bush appointee, as a U.S. attorney. There was even a scandal in the middle of the race about how he had talked to boogeyman Karl Rove about the evil genius Karl Rove about his governor's race, which essentially mixed politics and the Bush White House in a way that could have been really dangerous for Christie, and yet he won. So I think the lesson coming out of that is that voters don't necessarily like George Bush anymore, but they view him in 2010 as essentially irrelevant.
Yeah, I mean, it's clear that Bush is less of a factor than the current bad economy.
Right.
On the other hand, I guess from a Democratic point of view, you could argue that, well, U.S. Attorney is technically a nonpartisan post. He could distance himself a little bit from that. It's not like he was in the administration. So I would still expect, though, to see, say, next year, say, Rob Portman in the Ohio Senate race.
That could be.
Trade representative, Office of Management and Budget, they'll still use that Bush stuff against him.
And also had been a former member of the House Republican majority. So
Yeah.
that's true. All right, let's go to Virginia, right across the river. We can see Bob McDonnell's new kingdom right across the Potomac River from the Watergate offices. Big victory, big defeat, Republican sweep. They picked up seats in the state House of Delegates. They swept all 3 constitutional offices. Is Virginia still a purple state?
Yeah, I mean, the fact that it could go either way. I mean, Obama could certainly win. If he wins re-election, could win Virginia again. But there's no question, it's still kind of a red tinting state.
Okay,
but
so
I
a
mean,
red tinting purple, sort of like a violet.
yeah, I mean, no question, Creed Deeds is 41%. That's the lowest a Democrat has gotten in Virginia in quite a while.
Right.
On the other hand, let's not forget, say, for example, Jim Gilmore in the Senate race, he got like 35% last year.
Right.
So there is a huge swing vote in Virginia. So I think it's almost a stereotypical definition of a purple state, but it may have a little red tint to it.
Interesting. I think a big part of Creed Deeds' problem was just his inability to stick to a message. I mean, he was unable to. He was fighting the cap and trade issue. He was struggling to defend himself against an issue that he's never voted on in the House, in the U.S. House, on cap and trade. He doesn't support. He came out and opposed, and yet Republicans somehow were able to link him to an unpopular Democratic federal policy. And I think more than anything, that shows, it's a small example of the lack of discipline within the Creed Deeds campaign. So I really do think in this case, it was an undisciplined campaign and one of the worst campaigns run in Virginia in a long time.
Oh, no question
I'm
about
just
it.
saying.
You're right as always, John.
I am often correct.
I learned
New York 23, also interesting. So much to talk about here today, Quinn. I wish we had more time. All right, Congressman-elect, he actually might be congressman by now, Congressman-elect Bill Owens, a Democrat from a part of upstate New York that has not elected a Democrat, Quinn, in more than a century. How did that happen? And how is that? That goes so contrary to what we've just been talking about, this Republican momentum.
Yeah, I mean, they haven't elected a Democrat to the House, but I mean, it is a district that Obama won last year. It is arguably a slightly Democratic trending district. I mean, I think it really is true that in this case, I think it's a matter of local politics, really. I mean, yes, Skosovava dropped out the last minute, but she and Hoffman had so, I guess, sort of, mortally injured each other, and Owens had kind of stayed above it all,
right,
that he was, naturally maybe just a stronger, more attractive candidate than Hoffman.
I think that a couple of the national takeaways from New York 23 are that Sarah Palin is very, very toxic, and it's very complicated to figure out as a national politician how you associate yourself, a national Republican, how you associate yourself with Sarah Palin. The minute she went in there and campaigned for Doug Hoffman, I think she mobilized and energized the liberal base behind Bill Owens in a way that she was never able to compensate for or equate for the conservative side.
And Hoffman lost one of his main advantages, which is that he's not in the 2 major parties, he's an independent. But then when you have all these national Republicans sort of coming out for you,
right? Well, he almost had the worst of both worlds because he didn't want to be a national Republican. But if you're going to be a local candidate, then you should know local issues. But as we saw from local coverage of the election in the Watertown Daily News, the Daily Times, he was not very well versed on local issues. So
yeah,
a big problem for him. All right, now one thing I do want to mention: there was a word of caution coming from Nathan Daschle, the DGA Executive Director, not to read too much into last night. Let's look at what he had to say.
But I think we ought to caution ourselves to not read too much into them. And let's keep one thing in mind. Last night was the 6th time in a row that both of these states went against the White House. It's what they do.
All right, last word, Quinn McCord. Tell me, is Nathan right or is Nick right? Nick or Nathan? Is it a national referendum? Is there a national dynamic going on here? Or were these local races that shouldn't be too important?
I would say they're both right. I think there is a national dynamic, but you can't really say it's a referendum. You know, there are warning signs, there's a bit of a wind, it could grow into a hurricane, but it could just sort of stay as a light breeze.
Tropical storm. You know, I hate to say this because, you know, it's so rarely the case, but I think you are, in fact, correct. Quinn McCord. And that is my last word for Hotline TV today. Thanks so much for joining us. Have a great day.